And welcome to Research Ethics Mod 3.8. Here are your learning objectives, and here is your vocab. It's pretty slim. So we're going to talk about human research first. So much of this research actually takes place on college campuses and universities throughout the United States, and really around the world. But most psychological research actually takes place in the United States. It also can happen at hospitals or other health institutions. The National Institute for Mental Health is like the third largest group for research. So you can't just create a study and then go do the study. There has to be, you have to submit a proposal for your research idea, and it has to go by a peer-reviewed committee. So they're going to review everything, and they're going to compare it to the American Psychological Association's guidelines for ethics. So they're going to make sure that nothing in your study is violating an ethical guideline. And if it is, then you're going to have to go back and change it to make sure it fits to get approval. So you need the APA committee approval for your study to go. All right, so the first principle, there are 4 principles for human research. The first is informed consent, meaning that the researcher has to inform any participants before they start the study about any sort of risk or harm that could occur during the study. And participant might sign and agree to do the study, but during the study might decide to withdraw. They have the right to withdraw at any point in a study. The researcher is allowed to not inform them about certain things if that certain thing would change. It's something that, like, if they knew this, it would be hard to study it. So for example, if we're trying to study how much people pay attention, and we tell all of the participants, we're studying how well you can pay attention to this versus this, whatever. If you tell them that, the participant might really try to pay attention more, and that would skew the results. So you're just telling them what's going to happen, what to expect, but you're not necessarily telling them what you're looking at, because that could change the results. But that would still be considered informed consent. Principle 2 is the right to be protected from harm. So again, you're informed of any risks, but also the researchers have to make sure that they're not doing anything that can cause, obviously, physical or psychological harm to the participants or some sort of discomfort. If there is, like, maybe in your study they're going to be have like a rubber band on their hand that they have to like kind of slap against their hand. So is that discomfort? Sure. But it's not like long-term severe thing. So they would tell the participant that you're going to feel a little discomfort because we're going to take a rubber band and slap it against your wrist. And that way they're informed of any sort of risk that they have. The next principle, principle 3, is confidentiality. And this is where researchers cannot release your data. They can't even discuss your data, like using your name, like to other researchers. It's secure. Your information is private. If when they release the study, you're just a data point. Your results are just a data point, and not obviously specifically named in any way. Principle 4 is debriefing. So after the study, especially if there's been some sort of deception, like the paying attention example, they would after say, we were really trying to study, how much people paid attention to this thing over this thing. So in the debriefing, they give you your personal results and they tell you any sort of explanation of what they were actually trying to do. So animals, why do we use animals for psychological research? So we actually have a lot of curiosity towards understanding animals, and so that drives some of the research itself, just to like understand how they behave. There are also biological and behavioral similarities between animals and humans, and so they're helpful to us in that way. But you can't just study a human because they are us. They're obviously very similar. Because animals, especially like mice and rats, for example, who are most commonly used, they have shorter lifespans, which means if we're trying to study like the genetic effects of something over several generations, we can see that in mice and rats much faster than we could in humans. And it's also a very controlled environment. So if we're trying to see the effects of eating highly processed foods over time, well, they have a shorter lifespan, and I can control an animal's diet in every way, where I can't really do that for humans, or humans are just less likely to agree to a study like that where they're controlled in that way. Maybe you're trying to study sleep over years even. Again, that would be easier to do with animals versus humans. So procedures that would be unethical to perform on humans are sometimes performed on animals. But every care to make animals comfortable, to give them everything they need, is done in those situations. Moving on to that, protection of animal rights. So there's federal legislation that the vast majority of psychological researchers support, that protects animals' rights. It says that animals have to have clean housing, they have to have good air ventilation, they have to have food, and generally well cared for, not put in pain as much as possible, or at all, if possible. So we use a lot of this research too, goes into helping animals have a better life. So for example, like if you think of a zoo and you think of like, what's the right kind of environment for giraffes? Like, what do they need? What makes them happy? Is it living with a lot of giraffes, some giraffes, how much space? All those kinds of things. Those are questions that you would study in psychological research to give animals a better life. And so we do a lot of that research. Finally, your takeaways. So remember, a review board must ensure that the 4 basic principles are followed in any study. Animals are useful to research because of the shorter lifespan and because we can control their environment. So we can really test out our variables a lot easier. And finally, don't forget there are a lot of positives that come out of studying animals, such as providing them a better quality of life, whether they are endangered, whether they are in a zoo because they're endangered or injured, or many other, or just there are pets, right? So that wraps up 3.8, and I will